here at the beginning of this unit on water balance, acid base, and electrolyte, I want to write a few things that you all can write on directly on your slide page. I'm going to write them over here that are kind of general concepts that are important to understand first, so that water balance and fluids and electrolytes and pH make sense for why it's so important. So here's some key concepts to know or to remember before we get into this stuff. So the first key concept is that, this is one we talked about a lot, water diffuses toward areas that have overall less water. So we can describe this in different ways. We describe it as water follows salt. We describe it as osmosis. That's osmosis as well. We describe it as water moving toward a hypotonic solution. So all of those things that you've learned in the past about water movement and osmosis and so on, that's foundational to understanding all of this stuff. The second key concept is that our bodies have to do homeostasis of electrolyte concentrations and pH within some pretty narrow limits. What I mean by this is our bodies cannot tolerate large swings in electrolyte levels or large swings in pH. I'm sorry this marker is orange. I know it's hard to read. Homeostasis of electrolyte concentration and pH within narrow limits. Let me add on to this to make it a little bit more grammatical. We must maintain homeostasis of electrolyte levels and of pH levels in a really narrow range. You know, if we were measuring fluctuations in those, it's, you know, just barely, slightly up, slightly down, slightly up, slightly down. We can't suddenly have a big change in blood sodium. We can't suddenly have a big change in blood pH. If that happens, it's going to cause really dire consequences for health. So controlling levels of these things is critically important. And we have to also remember that water is generally going to move to balance out solute concentrations. Those two facts are really foundational to understand this unit in general. There's a video. The first slide that you've got here, it says nephron function. Is that what it says? Review, nephron function. That's a review video that's really good. I decided it's too long to show at the start of class. It is on Blackboard. It's a really good review. So I would encourage you to watch that later. If we have time, we'll watch it at the end of class. But I want to have enough time to talk about water and electrolyte balance. You've probably heard that you are some large percent of water, that most of your body weight is made up of water, and that's true. And we can take all of the fluids in our body, which are considerable in amount, and we divide them into different fluid compartments. And this is sort of a weird terminology. Like, I think of compartment as something that's made out of plastic, and then you put this item in this compartment, and so on. So it's strange terminology, but it's a way of thinking about how do we categorize body fluids. So we can categorize the compartments as they are intracellular or intracellular fluid. And that's the water that is inside a cell membrane. It's inside a cell, it's within a plasma membrane. That's intracellular fluid. It's abbreviated ICF. And most of the water in our bodies is inside cells in the form of intracellular fluid. So that's a compartment. The other compartment then is the extracellular fluid. And that is water that's not contained within a cell. It's outside a cell, extracellular. And that's abbreviated ECF, and these are roughly 2/3, 1/3 overall. I don't so much care about you knowing the percentages, but the meaning and the abbreviations are very important. So either the fluids are inside cells or they're outside cells. And this is showing you the average person has 40 liters of fluids in their body. Here's a different way of looking at body fluids in an interesting graphic. So this square, rectangle, is representing all the fluids, and it's showing that 63% are inside cells. We don't further classify those really. But the extracellular fluid falls into a few different categories. So if it's outside a cell, but still technically contained within the body, it's intracellular, and it falls into these 4 categories. And this semester we've talked about 3 of those specifically in detail so far. Interstitial, this is what I tend to call tissue fluid. Tissue fluid. Interstitial fluid. Plasma in the blood. Lymph or lymphatic fluid. This one needs a little bit more explanation. Transcellular. So this slide lists those again for you. And under transcellular fluid, if it were me, I would call that miscellaneous fluids instead of transcellular. But here's some examples of what those could be. So cerebrospinal fluid that runs through the ventricles of your brain and up and down through your spinal cavity. That's one of the transcellular fluids. Synovial, where is that?
Joints.
Inside joint capsules, so that lubricating fluid. Other places where you have serous fluid, like between the lining of your heart and the lining of your torso cavity. So those fluids that help organs slip past each other, that's serous fluid. And then also, another major place is the humors in British spelling, inside your eye. Vitreous humor and aqueous humor, humors of the eye. Let's see if I maybe have a darker marker. No, I don't, because I didn't bring my cursor. But I'll try to read those off. So cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid, serous fluid, and the humors within your eye. Those would be transcellular, or miscellaneous, as I think of them. So those are the distributions of the fluids in their general amounts and whether they're inside cells or outside cells. And this picture is listing several of those, and it's showing arrows moving back and forth, or sometimes in one direction, sometimes in the other. But it's showing that these compartments or these divisions of fluids, they're not standoffish. They're not really separate from each other because water can move in different directions. So these arrows are representing water movement. And water is going to generally move via osmosis to a place where there's less water or a place where there is more solute concentration. And we have a new term here that's maybe new. which is osmolality. Sounds great. Sounds scary. Here's what it means. So this is defining osmolality. So you might draw an arrow out. This is what osmolality is. Osmolality, I'm going to write darker, is a measure of overall solute concentration. Osmolality. How much solute is dissolved in that liquid? How much stuff is in the liquid that's not water? That's what osmolality is like. So if I have glass of water, glass of Gatorade, it's kind of fun. Glass of Kool-Aid. Glass of Kool-Aid. Which one of those has the highest osmolality? I think Kool-Aid. I think it would be Kool-Aid. All of these have water. Water on its own, this has very little stuff dissolved in it. Gatorade has some level of stuff dissolved in it. Kool-Aid has some level of stuff dissolved in it. I feel like Kool-Aid is the most.
Well, would it matter with how many electrolytes, or is it just anything dissolved in it?
Anything.
Okay.
Anything. And that's why it's not just electrolytes, it's any solute. So osmolarity is not the same as molarity of sodium or molarity of glucose. It's everything. It's like, we don't want to know just how many guys are in this room. We want to know how many people are in this room. Everything. So it's any solute. Proteins, sugars, electrolytes, vitamins, anything that's dissolved adds together to give osmolarity. So Gatorade does have more electrolytes than Kool-Aid, that's true. But Kool-Aid has so much sugar in it. It's shocking when you're grown up and you go and make the Kool-Aid. Oh my goodness. It's that much sugar, it's that much sugar. So this one has high osmolarity because there's a lot of stuff dissolved in there. It may not all be good for you, but there's a lot dissolved. It's very concentrated. We think of it that way. This one has low osmolarity. And the Gatorade would be in the middle. So I'm going to leave this picture up here because that will help explain some things later. But osmolarity or osmolality is measuring all the solutes at once. So water will move in the direction of higher osmolarity. Water follows salt, water follows solute. Water will move to balance osmolality. And that's one driving force. The other driving force is just hydrostatic pressure of water. And remember, we talked about these back when we looked at capillary beds. Remember those pictures where there was a big arrow pointing one way, maybe outside the capillary? That was the hydrostatic. And then there was a smaller arrow coming back into the capillary that represented osmotic pressure. Those two pressures are always the options for what will move water. And they might be in opposing directions, they might be in the same direction, but these arrows are representing water moving by one or both of those forces. So we've looked at that before, but now we come back and look at it in more depth. How's this seem so far? Monday and Tuesday in lab, we're going to do osmosis experiments, which are fun and help to make this less abstract. So that's what we'll be doing next week. So, it's important to keep body fluids balanced. Water will follow solutes, will follow towards higher osmolarity. And somehow we have to keep these fluid levels balanced. It's really important to keep fluid levels balanced. And our bodies do a lot for us in that regard. We don't have to be always hyper aware of, am I drinking enough water today? I know some of you are, and that's good. But if you don't, your body will generally take care of that problem for you within reason. And we generally can do that by ingesting fluids, which is a conscious decision usually, if we're conscious to do so. But our bodies do this for us. So how much urine is produced is interesting, yes, but it's critical to help balance levels of these different body substances. So we can change how much water we ingest, we can change how much urine we release. And those are the two major ways to adjust fluids. So the intake of water, this again is mostly a decision. This is something that we generally decide to do in some way on a daily basis by what we drink. And look how much water we get out of foods. It can be a considerable amount out of foods, especially if you're eating a lot of fresh produce and moist foods. This one is not a decision. This is water that's being produced chemically by our body doing reactions. And that does contribute, but it's a pretty minor amount. So most of the water that enters our body, it's from what we eat and drink, which is that's not hard to understand. Water output also is not hard to understand, but there are a couple of, one of these we tend not to think about. So urine, that's water leaving the body. That's easy to see or experience. There's water in feces. The amount can vary based on your fiber intake, but that's a decent amount, 6%. Perspiration, this would be maybe in a sedentary person. If you're exercising a lot, your perspiration percentage of water is going to go up. But for your average person on an average day, this one is one that we don't think about. But when you're little, or I still do this, and you breathe out on a day like today, and you do dragon breath, and you can see the water vapor coming out into the air, you're losing quite a lot of water just by breathing in and out, and some through your skin as well. But that's the one we don't think about, and that's more than comes out in feces or sweat for the average person. Yeah?
Would you have more water come out of your, like, just breathing if it was like a drier environment?
Yes, because it's a steeper concentration gradient. Do any of you watch those silly shows, Naked and Afraid, or the ones that are like that? Where they're so, my husband likes to watch those, and I'll be sitting there and I just think, why don't you all just go home? Why would you want to do that? But they have to worry much more about dehydration when they're in a dry environment. If you're in a very humid environment, you're still losing water through breathing out, but it's going to be much less. So, yes, these are averages for some average person in average conditions, but those would change based on what you're doing and what your environment is like. Yes, good question. And then those other shows like, what's that Bear Grylls one?
Oh,
where people are re-ingesting, you can do that if you have to.
You saw him in Marshall.
Survivor Man is better than the Bear Grylls one. It's less fake. Anyway, that's a but we don't tend to usually think about those, except for me, in relation to those shows. So it's important to keep water balanced. There are several ways that can get messed up. or disorders of water balance. And the one that you're most familiar with hearing about is dehydration. So we know that dehydration occurs when you're not drinking enough. When else do we worry about people getting dehydrated? Yeah. So diarrhea, vomiting, that would be changing drastically how much water is lost in feces. And the reason that you're losing water is it's not getting reabsorbed in the large intestine for some reason. Various reasons that we talked about before, but that could cause dehydration. Extreme vomiting can cause dehydration. We don't really have people getting dehydrated from over urinating so much because that's a more regulated process. I guess it could happen. If you're sweating a lot, that will contribute to it. But the real problem why dehydration is dangerous is that your extracellular fluid becomes too concentrated. Too concentrated. So imagine Gatorade is actually somewhat mimicking normal body ion levels, which is why it was so groundbreaking when it was introduced so long ago. We say it's isotonic. So imagine if your normal fluid balance is supposed to be like Gatorade, but you don't have enough water retained within your body, you're going to move toward more of this situation. Your body fluids are going to become more concentrated. And when your extracellular fluid becomes more concentrated, water will leave cells. Water will leave the inside of cells. Here's a cell. Here's its nucleus. If this is getting more concentrated or relatively less water, there's nothing, oh that's horrible, there's nothing to stop water from going out of the cell and this way, and that's what happens. So if you get severely dehydrated, your cells themselves will lose water, and your solute concentrations will be too concentrated all over your body. When that starts to happen, your kidneys will help you out by producing less urine. You don't decide that, your body decides it for you. You're going to produce less urine. But if you're not making as much urine, you don't have as much opportunity to get wastes out of the body that will slightly start to build up. And if you don't restore fluids, either by drinking or getting an IV, are the major ways, you will get your electrolytes out of balance. So in this, would your electrolytes become too high of a concentration or too low of a concentration? Too high. Because water is leaving, the electrolytes amounts are staying the same, that makes them more concentrated or they're too high. So you might write that here, that your levels of ions would be too high. If they get too much too high, that causes really serious problems. Okay, number 2 is the opposite situation. If you've heard that you can drink so much water that you will kill yourself, that is technically true. That is technically true. And that would be, the technical term for it is hypotonic hydration.
Why do you say like it's technically true, like it's impossible or something?
You can't accidentally, that doesn't accidentally happen, let me say. So it is true. It is true, but it is rare.
Well, I know someone like that happened to and they died, and I don't think it was on purpose.
Yeah, I don't mean that
I'm not
it's on
saying
purpose.
like
I don't
I'm
mean
not
that
saying
people
like to
would
like try to make you offended
choose
or
it.
anything.
No.
I'm
If
just
you
saying.
if you've heard that can happen and you thought that it was an urban legend, it's not.
Yeah, I know.
It can happen under certain circumstances, which we'll talk about next. Some people will also refer to it as water intoxication, but either of these terms are correct. The reason why this is dangerous is it's basically the opposite of dehydration. So if dehydration makes your levels of ions too high, if your levels of ions get too low because you're intaking so much extra water, that's dangerous as well. So for example, sodium, you are supposed to be maintaining sodium in your body at a level of 9, I think the unit on this is mgs per kilogram. I'm not sure about the unit, but the level is between 9 and 11. Can't get less than 9, it can't get more than 11. So if you've got a certain amount of sodium and you essentially drown it out by drinking more and more water, you get below 9, and then your brain and your muscle activity won't work correctly. You won't do membrane depolarizations correctly. You don't have enough sodium to cause the correct electrical effects when they move across membranes. And okay, so when this would happen is when someone is drinking too much plain water too fast. And I don't have that on here, it's probably important to put. Too much plain water too fast all at once. So you can imagine how this could happen. If someone is so thirsty and they're just guzzling water, and it would have to be really high amounts all at once. It's possible that you can over-dilute your fluids and get ion levels that are too low that would cause you to pass out and possibly die. That's how it happens. When my dad was a really good high school athlete, and when he was in middle school, he was playing on the high school football team, and back then their coaches would not let them drink water after practice, or I guess in the midst of practice, no water. Which is really extreme and also kind of dangerous, but it's based on this principle that, well, you don't want to overdo it, you don't want to drink too much water, you need to get the balance right. So these days, athletes tend to drink maybe not always plain water, but more isotonic solutions or electrolyte replacements, because if you're drinking something like this, you're ingesting water and electrolytes at the same time. Thus, your levels will not get as out of whack. Does that make sense? I don't want you all to be afraid to drink water after you exercise and when you're thirsty, but if you overdo it, this can happen, or you can get down on the low end and feel dizzy and weak. If you're playing sports through King, your athletic trainers are going to be aware of this and watching for it. Yeah.
So I know quite a few cyclists that just drink water because the sports drinks get expensive whenever you're doing a couple drinks a ride. So I guess if we're sweating a lot, we're losing those electrolytes, and then we're taking in a lot of water, we're more chance for...
There's more chance. I'm not the type of trained person that can tell you need to carry salt tablets, or this is how much you should be ingesting every hour or so on, but I think your coaches are going to know. And so whatever your coaches should know, your trainers should know, and most people are not going to get into a situation where they're really getting that close to this. But it's a possibility. So those of you that are going on to the exercise phys, you're the ones that most need to know this. Nurses don't see it that often. It's kind of rare. But it requires sweating. So not just being really dehydrated, but you've sweated out a lot, and you're getting too much plain water, not enough electrolyte replacements, that your ion levels drop too low. I don't want to be alarmist. This is not something that's happening frequently, but it can happen. Good questions, though. We'll move on from that. So when you do that, when you're chugging water, you will start urinating in a few minutes, but in the meantime, that's when this is a problem. your kidneys can't balance the water as fast as it's coming in, and you end up with ion imbalances. Oh, gotta hurry up. So if you've heard these terms, isotonic, we don't use this so much in the US, but in other countries, if you go to Asia and you're looking for something like Gatorade, they market it as isotonic because apparently schools teach that better there. And everyone would be like, oh yeah, isotonic, I know what that is. Here, I feel like if you put isotonic on a drink, that people would seize up with fear in the store and remember, oh man, that used to stress me out so much in class, this stuff. And I don't think that people would buy it because of limbic system activation, but hypotonic means less solute. You might add that onto here. And we'll review this some more next week in lab. Less solute, more solute, same solute. I may actually print this out and bring it to lab next week. Less solute, equal solute, more solute. And this is also showing you, in general, what's the general water level of that? What's the general water level of that? So let's maybe put that over here. So Gatorade, we consider it to be an isotonic drink because its water levels are generally equivalent to body fluid water levels. This would be a hypotonic solution because it doesn't have much solute in it, mostly water. This one is hypertonic. Hypertonic. And if you drink a lot of Kool-Aid, you're ingesting so much sugar that it will actually make you retain water. You would actually pee out less than you drank in because your body is going to have to retain water to balance all that sugar in the short term. We're not going to do that kind of experiment, but it is a measurable effect. So here we go again with edema. How many times have we talked about edema in this class? At least three. At least three different sections. So this one, you're more familiar with it. This is the same person's hand. I'm sorry, the same person's right and left hands. They've got edema on one arm, but not the other. This could be an example of blocked lymphatic drainage. Like maybe they had breast cancer surgery on this side, and they took out lymph nodes, and now their arm is not draining lymph. This is what that could look like, or when that could happen. But edema is specifically when you've got too much liquid, specifically in the tissue fluid or in the extracellular interstitial fluid. And we've talked about edema multiple times because it occurs with problems in multiple body systems. So, firstly, if you're really protein deficient and you don't have enough to make plasma proteins that provide that osmotic pressure to pull back in, that could cause edema. Lymphatic obstruction. If you can't drain lymph out of an area, that particular area will get swollen up and have edema. Liver failure, because your liver makes plasma proteins, generally. And kidney failure, because your kidneys are supposed to be getting rid of excess water generally. So when you see edema, it could be from a lot of different reasons. Really a lot of different reasons, but it is an example of a fluid imbalance. And the feet, maybe you can't see it, but this is that pressure test I told you about where you push and you see if it bounces back, and if it doesn't, that's a sign of edema. That's what that looks like. Okay, so we have many ways of regulating our water balance besides just deciding to drink more. We have three particular hormones, at least, that help us control our levels of body fluids. And this segment is one of the one of the things that you need to make a note to memorize and be able to work problems with. So some of what we do in the ALA will relate to this next week. All of these hormones start with A, which is unfortunate. They're all affecting blood pressure because they're changing how much sodium and water our kidneys are reabsorbing out of the filtrate. So all of these affect fluid balance, all of them affect blood pressure, and I'm going to want you to know for each one of these three, what does that hormone do to blood pressure? Raise it or lower it? What does it do to urine output? Do you urinate more or do you urinate less? Both of those are, it's a 50-50 guess. I'm not saying that you should guess, but your blood pressure can go up or it can go down. Your urine output can increase or decrease. This one's more complicated. I want you to know why does the hormone affect those two that way? What's it literally doing to kidney function? So this is something that you could start studying for immediately after today. The first one of these, we've heard of it before, it's antidiuretic hormone. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. We talked about this a little bit in the section on kidneys. It can also be called vasopressin. Generally, the people that call it vasopressin are older or sometimes from another country. So if you work with doctors that are older or maybe they had their training in a different country, they might call it vasopressin. The American current term is more ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And we talked about that this causes the tubule system to reabsorb more water during that step of, toward the end of tubular secretion. They reabsorb more water. So this is what starts the process of making ADH. Make a note there. This making ADH is caused by increasing blood osmolality. So you have increased blood osmolality, then we start producing ADH. Then we have the aquaporins, or those water channels, going into distal convoluted tubule in the collecting duct. So you might want to draw an arrow from here to here to here. What does this mean? What does it mean to have increased blood osmolality? More solute. More solute. More solute than normal. So, especially if I write back up here the sodium levels, we're supposed to be keeping sodium between 9 and 11 something per kilogram. Which end of this would represent increased osmolality? Would we be more at 9 or more at 11 would start this? More toward 11. Like we're getting too much solute, we're getting too much concentration of sodium. Our bodies do not wait until it gets to 11. It's not like, okay, 11, it's getting higher and we activate the system before it gets to that point. So increasing, not really past 11. So, all right, if our fluids are too concentrated, we need to keep more water to balance out those levels. So if I'm up at 10.9 or something like that, I could get that number down if I had more water to dissolve it. Does that make sense? Like if I make my Kool-Aid too strong, I can water it down. If you ever get to a point in your life where you're going to make a lot of Kool-Aid, it's better to make it a little strong and then water it down than to put too much water to start. So this is watering down body fluids by keeping more water in the blood. We want to have more water available in the blood to balance out those levels. And that's also going to increase blood volume. So we're going to have more blood volume because we're keeping more water in the blood. We're going to do that by letting less water out in the urine. We could also do this by drinking more, but this is activated sometimes before we even feel thirsty. Our bodies don't, it's like, let's not just wait for people to get thirsty. Let's involuntarily take care of this now by peeing less. So we need more water in the blood. We need more water reabsorbed back into the blood. That leaves less water in the urine. So this is a urine concentrating mechanism. And it's kicked off by sensing, oh, my blood's getting too concentrated. My electrolyte or solute levels are getting too high. So we make antidiuretic hormone. It makes it easier for the blood to reabsorb water. We make less urine. We're keeping more water in the blood, and that makes blood pressure go up. So ADH increases blood pressure, and it causes water retention, antidiuretic. The second hormone, and this is a picture of generally how that's happening. We're pulling more water back out of the filtrate, concentrating urine, and the water is staying in the blood to balance out those solute levels. Less water in the urine, less urine, more water in the blood, higher blood pressure, but that's less dangerous than having ion levels imbalanced. Okay. Number 2, aldosterone. You might want to reference back in your notes quite a ways where we talked about renin, angiotensin aldosterone system. This was ALA2. So you might want to dig those back out and study that stuff along with, because this is related to it. Aldosterone. The video, they're going to say it aldosterone, because I think they're Australian. Either pronunciation is fine. Aldosterone has the same overall effects as ADH. They're doing the same general things overall. Whoops, I want to get all those up there. Have you go ahead and write them down. And aldosterone is not causing directly more water retention, it's causing more sodium retention. And that's the major difference between how this acts in ADH. Aldosterone reclaims sodium, and then water follows the sodium. ADH reclaims water directly. But both of them result in, we reabsorb water, which increases blood pressure. We make less urine because we're reabsorbing more water out of the filtrate. And then, let's stop. I want to run over. On Friday we will start right back here. And you also will need to bring slides for acid-base